All right, everybody, thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to start with a couple housekeeping items. And again, thank you for joining us in this ongoing series around family engagement and taking time out of your day to join us. So a couple things that I want to go over real quickly. If this is your first time joining us, thank you for coming today. The topic is from the beginning. It's hard to believe that a school year is almost over and a new school year is upon us. So Steve's going to go over how to start off the year right from the beginning. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, Kellen will send out a link to you that has the 4 or 5 that we've done. And again, this is a ongoing series in family engagement. This particular webinar, for those of you that weren't able to make it today but registered, will be available 24 to 48 hours after we conclude today, and we'll send that out in a link to you. And last but not least, in terms of housekeeping items, if you'd like to join this conversation on Twitter, we'd ask that you use the hashtag #EngageWebinar, and Kellen will be posting things and engaging on Twitter with those of you that would like to do that as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. I would say we've had the most engagement that we've had to date in terms of your questions. So thank you for those of you that did that. We had a ton of questions come in. We will try to get to those questions at the end of the webinar today. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Constantino, who will, I've had a chance to work with Steve for a long time. Always a pleasure to hear what he has to say. He speaks nationally, and we're honored that you're here today, Steve. So take it away.
Thanks, Gary. We have to stop meeting like this. No, it's a pleasure to be here, everyone, and thank you so much. And I'm also very appreciative of the fact that this is an extremely busy time of year for all of you. Most of us, I think, by this point are finished with spring break, and then there's this long stretch of road between spring break and the end of the school year. And I know that you're on that journey right now. So the fact that you are interested in this topic, that many of you are with us live and many of you will listen to the recording, is extremely gratifying to me. And I want to make sure that I thank you for your time. And I will try not to waste it, and I will try to make it as meaningful as we can. With that said, we're going to launch into a topic today that I think is a little meaty. And I'll warn you right up front that it gets a little deep a little quickly, because the most often asked question that I got, and many of you have already asked this question, is how do we get everyone to do this? How do we get everyone to believe that this is valuable? How do we get everyone to buy in? I hear that term a lot. And what I'm going to share with you today are the building blocks to get to that point. I think when I see schools that very much want to engage families, they tend to bypass what we're going to talk about today, and they go right to doing a strategy or doing stuff. Maybe it's, oh, we'll have an extra math night, or we'll have a picnic, or we'll have a celebration. We'll do something, because I think in the quest of doing something, we feel as though that we're moving toward that engagement. And that may be true, or that may not be true. What we see most often is in school districts. If you're in a school, I don't know what an average size school district is anymore, but if there's 10 schools in your school district, we often see that there's a few schools that have very much engaged the vast majority, if not all of their families, and a few schools that have not. And then if you bring that down into a school building, we have teachers who have been very thoughtful and very adept at engaging families, and then other teachers who have not had that experience. And so we end up with this inconsistency. We end up with engagement here and no engagement here, or little engagement here, a lot of engagement here. We have this lots of engagement at the elementary, not so much at the high school. What happens? And what we're trying to avoid are the families that are getting those mixed messages. We want you engaged, we don't want you engaged. We want you engaged, we don't want you engaged. Because what they'll default to is, forget it. I'm not going to ride this roller coaster anymore. So we're going to talk today about culture and how we can shape that culture, how we can get everyone to think about this as a conduit to improved student achievement. I was just reading today on Twitter. I didn't get a chance to read the article, but I saw somebody post something that Ken Leithwood had written. And Ken Leithwood is a pretty substantial researcher in the field of leadership, educational leadership, a real interesting thought leader. And apparently Dr. Leithwood has now said that one of the 4 pathways to student success is family engagement. And I don't know that that's the first time he has said it, but it's coming up again. So the idea that family engagement is important is undisputable. I think the questions that are in your mind is, how do we get some cohesiveness and continuity in the organization? If you followed along with the 5 principles at all, you will know that the culture principle, a culture to engage every family, is principle number 1. And it's not there by accident, it's there by design. And the reason it's there by design is because if we don't have a culture that truly believes that engaging families is a good thing to do, or that it can happen, because there are folks who don't believe that it is possible, then the likelihood of us building the necessary relationships, or the likelihood of us promoting the kind of efficacy that we need to promote, which we've talked about in previous webinars, is probably going to end up spotty again. It's going to end up inconsistent. Some people do it, some people don't. So how do we get everybody? Well, it starts with this overall, and again, from my perspective, it starts with this overall definition. And what I'd like to do is, and I don't know that there's a teacher anywhere who has not unpacked a standard. And so what I'd like to do a little bit is to unpack this, to talk about what I think are some key points in the definition. I think first is the word collective. You have to understand what everybody in your organization believes about an issue before you can move forward in changing or resolving or doing whatever it is you want to do with the topic. Very often we march forward and we make assumptions. We make assumptions that everybody's with us, or everybody will be with us because they're just going to be compliant, or you're going to do this because I said so. All of those things are very real in the culture of organizations, but all of them lead to a lack of success with many things that we are trying to implement in education that we know from research are good for kids. So we have to figure out, how do we know what everybody thinks? I think next is, this is what we need to know. What do you believe? What is your attitude about family engagement? I mean, ladies and gentlemen, honestly, I've talked to all kinds of people over the years, people who very much value family engagement, to people who do not. And it's just a reality. And while I don't like to admit that, and I try to work on those issues, I think what we need to know is, what do you believe? What are your values? And how do those drive your actions or inactions when working with families, or when thinking about families, or when discussing families? We're going to get into all of this today. Next is the word explicitly. One can embrace an idea or a notion, and one can explicitly embrace an idea or a notion. I can see evidence with explicitity. If I am the principal, or I am the leader, or I am the teacher, and I have a firm belief in something, then there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to be able to explicitly demonstrate that. Well, what we want is an explicit embrace and a commitment to this notion that family engagement is a good thing. Question, do we have it? That's some of the data that we need to collect in our schools. Next, is family engagement a core component of what you do? Every decision that is made, every action that is taken, everything that happens in your school or a district, is there what I call a family lens there? Is someone looking through that lens and understanding how the smallest of decisions may impact the engagement of families in the long run? There's a much better chance that it will be a good process if family engagement is a core component. And lastly, what are the organizational artifacts? We're going to talk about that. Artifacts are pretty easy. Artifacts are things that you can touch and feel and see and hear and smell. And we'll talk in a few minutes about the levels of culture. But I want to move it up a step to talk about organizational practice. What practices are in place that promote family engagement? And are they universal? Are they consistent? Is there continuity from teacher to teacher, from building to building, from school to school throughout the district? Those are all very interesting questions, all of which data can be collected to find out exactly where we are on all of those issues. When you have a chance, I want you to, next time you're at a faculty meeting or you have an opportunity to talk with those that you work with, ask them this question. I call this an igniting activity. I do this in workshops a lot. Suppose tomorrow every family in your community had an absolute choice to send their kid wherever they wanted to send them. There was no limitations whatsoever. Take all the limitations off the table. Would they choose you? Would they choose your school? Would they choose your classroom? And if you're, and whether your answer is yes or no, it's important to understand why. If your answer is yes, what is it that is so compelling about your product and service that families would choose it over competition? And if your answer is no, why is it no? What do you think is keeping you from answering that question as a yes? If nothing else, it incites some pretty interesting conversations, sometimes uncomfortable. But you'll find throughout this webinar that when we are trying to impact the culture of organization, chances are we're going to move people out of their comfort zone. We're going to have to be honest and look in the mirror and look at our practices and look at our beliefs and see what is impacting things positively and what might be impacting things negatively. John Goodlad, the famous educator, talked about culture many, many years ago. Every organization, this says school, but every organization, every school, every business, every church, every restaurant, every organization has a culture of its own. And if you look close enough, if you examine the culture close enough, you can always find things that can change and modify the culture to go from where you are to where you want to be. Interestingly, though, it's most often overlooked, and substituted for it are strategies. Quick, down and dirty, give me something that I can fix this problem tomorrow as if it were a leaky pipe. And my suggestion to you today is to take a step back and understand that engaging every family and turning disengagement around is a scaffolded process. And that process starts with this conversation, with these conversations, with these questions. A couple of thoughts. We don't think about culture every day. We get into school in the morning, the bell rings, we're off. And we don't have time to reflect on the school's culture. We have to find that time. We have to think about who we are, why we are, what we believe, what we value, and how that drives our attitudes and actions every day. I'm going to suggest to you that somewhere along the line in PD time or time when you are together, that you spend the time to ask, and I'm going to give you some things to talk about and think about as well. Everybody sees the same thing differently. Everybody that walks into the school in the morning doesn't see it the same way. Everybody that works in the school district doesn't have the same perception of the superintendent or the school board or others in the organization. So it's important to remember that even though it may appear that everybody sees it the same way, chances are they don't. If we give this treetop flyover look at our schools, hey, we're doing good, thumbs up. But I really think that when we start examining it closer, we can see something very different. I'll tell you a very quick story. I was invited to a middle school. It doesn't matter where and it doesn't matter when. And I was there pretty early in the morning. I was there a little bit earlier than I needed to be for the workshop. And the principal invited me to walk around the school and find out if there was anything that she could do to help make it what she called a more family-friendly atmosphere. And so I was nosing around the school, and I realized that at that time of day, the only activity that was really going on was the breakfast program. And so I wandered down to the cafeteria, and all of the middle school kids, as they got off the bus, they were lining up for breakfast. The gate was down, and so they couldn't get into the actual area to pick up their breakfasts yet. But that gate would come up, I guess, at a predetermined time. So the line got pretty long. I think there, as I recall, there was about 130 kids now in line waiting for breakfast. The gate came up. The cafeteria workers were there, and all of the kids went through the line. And everybody watches this every day, except me. I had never seen this before. And what I realized was that, and I watched this very carefully, 130 students went through the breakfast line with no adult ever talking to them or saying good morning. Now, I hope that's an extreme example, but it happened. That's the kind of thing that we have to start paying attention to. That's just one of a number of examples of culture that happens every day right in front of us, but we don't really take the time to stop and think about it. I use this in workshops, and I simply ask the audience, how many feet does the elephant have? And if that's not confusing enough for you, then I ask you how many legs the elephant has. And I ask the audience to shout out the answer. And I'll get anywhere between 4 and 9, I think, pretty much. And I use this. This is a drawing from a book that was published in 1991 called Mind Sights. It is an optical illusion, absolutely been drawn that way. But I use it to enunciate the fact that everyone sees the culture differently. And the answer to the question is the elephant has however many legs or feet that you see. There is no right or wrong answer. Same thing happens with the culture of our organizations. There's most leaders have probably heard of Deal and Peterson's book, Shaping School Culture. And on page 1, paragraph 1, the culture of an enterprise plays the dominant role in exemplary performance. Improve the culture, improve performance. Improve the culture, move closer to a goal. Try to fix the problem, try to circumvent the culture, then you are probably going to have a temporary fix that won't last. I ask my educator friends all the time, especially my veteran friends who've been around for a while, how many school years have you come back at the beginning of the year where the superintendent or the principal has laid out this year's initiatives? And everybody chuckles when I say that. And I'll say, and how many of those initiatives are still around? Suddenly it's not so funny. How many do you have data for which that you can prove that what you were supposed to do actually worked? And the answers get fewer and fewer. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the culture at work. It's not bad people. It's not bad ideas. It's simply the culture not embracing the change. And when the culture doesn't embrace the change does not occur. It's really pretty simple. Sims and Sims, I want to make sure for those of you who are interested in research and interested in the science background, the empirical data, most organizations, and this is very true of schools, we have this competition going between traditionalists and innovators. And family engagement falls somewhere in the middle of that. And so there's this little tug of war going on as to, this is what we do at this school. We have a very set way of doing things. We have a way of operating that may be unwritten, but it's the way we do it here. That can be a good thing or not a good thing. And in my experience, that tends to be one of the barriers to engaging every family because we have systems and processes in place that actually work against that. And I'll give you some examples of that as well. And lastly, you can't talk about culture of an organization without talking about the relationships between all of the people in the culture. That includes families. And so if you have a significant population of families that are not engaged, not involved, if you have a population of families that are difficult or combative, if you have a population of families that seemingly are apathetic, then there's an issue in the culture. And it is evidence that this work would be meaningful for you. To begin to look at and examine the organization, examine relationships and culture. This is something that I'm going to use to now springboard you into some examples of culture. Edgar Schein is a leading researcher in the area of organizational culture, and he talks about these 3 levels of culture. You see, level 1 is artifacts, things that you can hear and touch and feel and smell. And you get an idea of the organization by looking at things, by seeing things. I went to a school, I saw nobody talk to a group of students. That's an artifact. I saw something there. I see certain signs in school. I see certain ways schools present themselves. I see the way people present themselves. I see the way offices present themselves. I see the way people interact. And all of those things are all artifacts and tangible evidence of cultures of organizations. And then we move to these values and assumptions. What do we believe? What do we take for granted in our school? What do we assume? What assumptions do we make that may be very, very dangerous? What are our thoughts and feelings about any topic? Today, let's talk about family engagement. So what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit of a journey I'll give you some examples of these three things to kind of get your mind working on the kinds of things that you might want to look at. And then we'll give you some ways in which you can collect some data and maybe take a little measurement. Let's talk about artifacts. Everything that you're going to see is a picture that I have taken of a school that I have visited. Here's the first one. That's the first thing that I saw when I walked up to this particular school. I was at another school and I saw this. I'm not even sure what that means. Take a look at that. Ask yourself how many of those signs are now in front of your schools. The one that I most often don't see, welcome. We're glad you're here. Thank you for being here. We missed you. We appreciate you. Have a great day. They're out there, but I see these more. Now, maybe all of these are necessary. They probably are. There's probably some board rule or law somewhere that says you have to have them. But what I find interesting is that in most schools, I see the staff parking sign that says staff parking only, but never a sign that directs me to where I'm supposed to go if I'm not in the staff. Now, you may think these things are trivial. I assure you that they add together very quickly, and they're very quickly not so trivial. Culture is something that corporate America and organizations have taken very, very seriously. And if we had a longer period of time today, we could talk about some of that. But I go into a little bit more extensive discussion of culture in the books, and I also, obviously, in workshops and things like that. So one of the things that we offer, and by the way, the documents that I share with you today, you're going to get a copy of everything, all of these documents that you can use in your school system. It's yours to do what you want to. But this is the welcoming environment. This is not the whole thing. This is just a piece of it. The welcoming environment checklist. What I love to see is a group of people, teachers, principals, parents, people who are not in the school every day, to get together in a group, take this document and walk the school. People always ask me, Steve, what could we do first to become a more welcoming culture? And I'll say, go to the edge of your school property and pretend you've never been there. Can you find where you're going? And if you can, great. If you can't, there's a great place to start. Once you've done that, go back and do it again, but this time you don't speak or understand or read English. Or perhaps you're blind. Can you find where you're going? These are all cultural raindrops that when you pull them apart, you could argue, well, Steve, come on, you're kind of nitpicky. Maybe so. But I'm looking at the pool that is created as a result of it. So what we have done is we've collected all of this information that we know to be true about helping shape a better experience and culture in a school, and we've given you a way to collect that data. This is reasonable, meaningful data to talk about, do we even say welcome? Are we any place that somebody wants to go? If you went to your favorite restaurant and the first sign that you saw was, warning, shut off your cell phone, you're going to be arrested, would you go back to the restaurant? I'm just asking. Let's talk about some values. These are actual statements from policy books and teacher manuals that I've collected from around the country. I did not make these up. I'm not going to read them to you, but I think the point is clear. I'll make two comments. The middle orange box that says teachers are required to contact parents prior to issuing a grade of D or F is a pretty pervasive comment. And we suddenly realize that the only time that we're contacting people is to give them bad news. That's an aha moment for a lot of people. And that's the only thing that's in writing that we're required to do. There's no requirement to call anybody with good news, only requirement to call them with bad news. That tells me a lot about the culture of an organization. And then I'll also add in the last box on the bottom right-hand side, Walt Disney made a big deal between guests and visitors. And there is a difference between having a guest in your home and having a visitor at your home. I'm seeing more and more schools gravitate to signs that say family parking or guest parking, but still there's a visitor parking and visitor badges and visitor entrances and visitor rules. I'm concerned, you know, we certainly want to be respectful of teachers' busy schedules. I hope there's something in writing that's respectful of parents' busy schedules as well. So all of those things, again, they begin to tell me what's valued in the school system, these espoused values, as Dr. Shine talked about. One of the things that you can do tomorrow is you could get a piece of paper, or you could do this, you know, on email or however you want to do it. You simply ask the staff these 4 questions. No names, no grade levels, doesn't matter who submits it, but just ask them these 4 questions. And later on, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a survey that you can use, but just asking these 4 questions can tell you a great deal about the present culture of your organization and what you'll need to do to move forward to get to that, how do I get everybody on board? So interesting questions and again, you'll get all of this. This is a short survey that we are going to send to you. You can use it. It's a typical survey with a Likert scale. You can plug it into SurveyMonkey. You can give it to your staff, and it gives you a thumbnail idea of where people's attitudes and actions and beliefs and values are regarding family involvement in your school. It's simple. It can be done in literally 10 minutes or less. It doesn't matter who's, you know, I would say, find out if it's a parent or a teacher or an administrator who responded, but short of that, the questions are the questions. And I think that you'll get some really interesting information that you can use to have a conversation with your faculty as well. This is another chart that you're going to get, and this is a little bit deeper because I call this charting culture. And again, I'm showing you snippets of a larger document. You're going to get copies of that larger document. But down the left-hand side are these big statements and big questions that really need the reflection of everybody. And so how you read this is to take Dr. Shine's 3 levels of culture, and I've given you an example. What do we believe about how individuals are valued in the school? There may be teachers who don't feel valued at all. They need an opportunity to share how they feel. There may be families who don't feel valued. There's probably students that don't feel valued, principals that don't feel valued. So it's important conversations to have. What artifacts do we have that support our beliefs? If we believe that individuals are valued, then what artifacts support that? What underlying values support that? So you see where you're going with this. You take each of these topics, and there's a couple of pages of them. Again, you're not getting the whole thing, but it inspires the kind of conversation that can lead to real culture change, where you start to examine your own belief system and you start to realize that perhaps what you believe and value might be part of the problem that is keeping disengagement as an issue in your school or your district. By not doing that, though, by ignoring this kind of work, and then going right to a strategy. All teachers, like every year, every teacher will make 5 positive phone calls a week. How many years have I heard that one? How long does that last? How many teachers really made the phone calls? What did teachers think who didn't want to make the phone calls? Did we ever ask them why they were uncomfortable making the phone calls? Those are conversations that might be difficult, but are absolutely essential to moving forward. I want to play you a video, and I'm not going to talk about the video, but I want to say I've put the heading on the video of underlying assumptions. This was on CNN. I took it off CNN, it's about 4 minutes. There's a chance you've seen it, but if you haven't seen it, I want you to see it.
The college admissions scandal may seem shocking to some of us, Apparently, it's not surprising to many educators. Now, one elementary school principal is sharing his take on the scandal in a viral video that has been seen by more than 6 million people on Facebook. Here's a piece.
Everybody's just so surprised about this. You know who's not surprised? Or an educator in the whole world. Do you know why? Because this kind of thing happens a day at schools. You know what this is? A parent not agreeing with a policy or a rule, sometimes even a law, so they're just going to do whatever they want because they think it's best for their child. Yeah, I signed my child's reading log, but he didn't read, but we had a soccer game until 10 o'clock, and I disagree with that policy. They should have to read or a day anyways. You know who else disagrees with policies? Aunt Becky.
That principal, Gary Brooks, joins us now. He runs Liberty Elementary School in Lexington, Kentucky. Principal, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
It's a very funny viral video, but you say that you see this every day, bad behavior of one sort or another from parents. Like what? Give us examples of the kinds of things you see.
Absolutely. You know, we have parents that do love their children very much and want what's best for them. And sometimes that means breaking a rule. We have parents that sneak in fast food for lunch when they know that that's not, that's a school rule. We have parents that will bring their friends over to the family table when they come to eat with their own child, and they know they're not allowed to bring any extra people over, but their child wants that. We have people that send kids in scary costumes on character book day when we dress up as characters because their child loves that costume. And even though we're not allowed to have scary costumes, they do that. And so what we have is parents who truly love their children, and they really think that they're doing what's right. And sometimes they feel like that means breaking a rule, breaking a policy, and in this case, breaking a law.
You give other examples that I think are really fascinating. As you said, sign the planner showing that the child read when the child did not read that allotted amount of time at night, lying
Right.
about why their child is late to school, driving around the cones in the, you know, while you're waiting for the school bus so that you can get out faster than everybody else.
Right.
Letting their kids bring peanut butter to school, though obviously it could endanger other kids. I mean, that
Right.
seems like actually one in a different category. That seems
Right.
like a dangerous one. Letting them sneak sodas, letting
Right.
them skip doing their homework. What do you think is causing all of that kind of bending of the rules, or I guess just generally bad behavior?
Right. Well, I think it's a misunderstanding of what's best for your child. Every one of these parents, and that was one of the reasons I did the video, these parents truly love their children and think that they know what's best. And rather than following rules and setting the example they need to set, they choose to do what they think is best, which is break a rule. And so I think the bottom line is it comes back to them loving their child and thinking that what's best for their child is what their child wants or what they want, rather than setting an example they need to set and saying, we're not allowed to bring peanut butter. I know that's your favorite. I know that's the only thing you seem to want to eat, but you've got a child that has allergies in your classroom. We can't do it no matter what. It's a rule, rather than trying to sneak it in every once in a while or throwing a big fit about it, because that's a big, huge issue. But they really love their child and they think that's what they like. I want to give in to them, or that's the only thing they're going to eat. And so we're giving in to children based on the fact that we love them and we think we know what's best for them.
And what do you say to those parents when you confront them? And what's the solution to stopping this behavior?
Right. Well, we discussed, we have rules for a reason. And I think a lot of times they think the rule is silly or they don't understand it. And so when we say to a parent, you know, you're not allowed to walk your child to class, and this is why, they want to do that to talk to the teacher, to make the child feel safe. But when we actually explain the rule, you know, in my experience, 99.5% of the parents will go, oh, I didn't understand that. I just didn't think it was that big of a deal. And parents don't think it's that big of a deal. And if it's a parent, you know, I tell them, if you have a problem with the rule, come to the school, discuss what's going on, try to understand why it is. And there may be a possibility you could change a rule. There may be an exception to say, I really and truly have to get to work early. Is there any way I could do this? The schools will work with you, but don't just break a rule, because what you're doing is you're saying to your child, I know this is a rule, but it doesn't apply to us. And while that might benefit you in the short term, in the long term, it's going to be a difficult time for your child.
Principal Gary Brooks, thank you very much for this lesson in rule following to all of us. Great to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
The college admission.
I played the whole video for you, and as I said in the beginning, I'm not going to have a conversation about the video, but the video espouses some pretty detailed beliefs and values. And you could unpack that 4 minutes and probably have a multi-hour discussion about what we heard there, what we really heard there, what the message was, what the message wasn't. But I played the video for you. Chances are you might be one of the 6 million who've seen it. But if not, you have to decide what you think about that. And we all have to think whether or not we agree, or partially agree, or disagree, or think it's good, or think it's terrible. Doesn't matter. What's important is what we think. Because what we think will drive what happens with families. School culture does not fall from the sky. It's created and manipulated by people in the organization. And so it's something that we have to deal with. I would think it's probably some of the most important use of professional development time that you can use, because it's going to help every aspect of your organization. Not just family engagement. Culture, looking at culture and looking at cultural change will impact anything that you are trying to do in your school. Lasting change requires a change in school culture, which is a slow process. That's the hardest selling point of asking educators to get involved in this conversation. We're under such tremendous pressure to get something done. We have to show test scores. We can't be seen as failing. We can't be seen as negative. And that's a tremendous amount of pressure on educators. And what it does to us is that it forces us to cut corners. And we are looking for ways in which we can help our children quickly, because we're going to be judged by the entire world. What takes courage, in my opinion, is to try to put that aside, at least for a while, and say, what do we want? What are we doing to get it? And what could we do to get a different result? I think that's a tremendous use of teachers' time, because teachers and educators, in my experience, are extremely thoughtful people. And when given the opportunity, are very encouraging to share ideas and feelings and thoughts about things that we probably ought to talk about a little bit more. If you've been with us before, you know that all of the work that I've been doing is based on this logic model, the 5 principles. We've been talking mainly about number 1 today. We have had webinars that have talked about different parts of number 2 and number 3, but we thought that as you wind down the school year and as you think about family engagement being something that you would take a look at next year, where does it fit? Well, it's a good place to start. And you might not see any tangible evidence from it for a while. But those internal and external conversations that you have, the data that you collect, the aha moments that you have, are all going to move you forward to that goal that you have of those questions you have asked me. How do we get everyone? How do we get all? What do we do about, well, all means all, and that means the culture. And working on it would be a good use of your time, in my opinion. So there it is again, that's the descriptor, but for each one of the principles, we have created these clarifying statements. So underneath the heading of a culture that engages every family, underneath that definition that I unpacked with you at the beginning of the webinar, here are 3 statements that further define it. This is all going to be available to you. It's available on my website. The principles and the statements are there. It's also, makes up the book Engage Every Family, where not only do we give you all of the statements, but we give you the best practices so that you can measure yourself against what best practice would be for each one of these principles, each one of the definitions, and each one of the clarifying statements. So I'm not going to read these to you. I don't want to take that time, but you can, when you get a copy of this webinar, or if you want to go to the website and find it, these are great questions that can act as goals. They can act as standards. They can act as data points. They can do a lot of different things. And so to wrap this up before we get to questions, people often ask me, well, where do we go from here? Well, let me review. I've given you a pretty decisive definition of what culture is. We've delineated that culture now with clarifying statements. I've given you some ways in which you can collect data about people's attitudes and feelings towards family engagement. And I've also given you a way to collect data about the culture of the school with the cultural artifacts, the 3 levels of culture chart that I showed you. So there's going to be a lot there that you could do that, again, you know, is not going to be, oh, here's a strategy that's going to make everything better tomorrow. But it is going to begin to frame for you why, in some cases, we've not been successful. I'm going to leave you with 2 thoughts. Thought number 1, in my opinion, the minute you call something an initiative, you kill it. I would advise that if you want to begin the year with the theme of family engagement, or you want to talk about family engagement being a important component of the overall improvement of your school, I think that's wonderful. I believe the minute you use the word initiative, that's a problem, because initiatives come and go. Most of them are gone, and we don't want that to happen. Secondly, I want to go back to that comment I made about, you know, how many initiatives, how many things have we started in education over the years, only to find that they have evaporated into thin air. How is this going to be different? Well, it's going to be different if we examine the culture, if we take the time to examine the culture, to collect the data, to use the data to move us forward. Going back to the model, if we don't have a culture that values engaging every family, then the likelihood of us building a relationship with every family is diminished. And further diminished from that is the likelihood that we will promote that family's efficacy, where family engagement directly connects to student learning. So that's a quick, straight, deep dive into culture. And my pitch to you to take a look at this topic as something for you to grapple with, either as you're planning over the summer or as you're thinking about next year. But when people ask me, where do we start, Steve? It's here. It's with these conversations, which may not get 5 more people to come to math night initially, but it will help with the overall understanding of where we are and where we want to be. So thank you for listening. And Gary, I think I may have answered some of the questions. I may not have, but you'll straighten me out.
Awesome, Dr. Constantino, thank you. There is a ton to unpack in what we just went through. I just want to say, if you have some, we're going to try to get to as many of these as we can. If you do have some questions that you didn't get a chance to submit ahead of time, go ahead and do that now. There should be a little button that says Q&A, and you can type those in. If we don't get to them in the webinar, we'll get to them post the webinar, try to get those questions answered for you. But Dr. Constantino, you talked a lot about culture and getting started, and then you said it's a slow process. And kind of what went through my head is culture change can create friction.
Yes.
And a couple of the questions were kind of aligned around that, so I'm going to try to group these together. But it was, you gave us some strategies for polls and charting culture, but I think there's a step before that some of the folks in the audience are trying to figure out is, one person put it in this way: how do you start from scratch and change a mindset? Another one said, how do I, as the one person in the school that believes this, create that change? I think they're looking for some guidance in, okay, before I can even get to the poll, there's some work I have to do. What might that look like?
I think if you're the leader of the school or the district, and I know we have a varied audience out there, so we have district leaders, building leaders, teachers, who knows who we have listening. But we have to have a space where we all feel safe to say what we believe. If that's not there, then you can't do some of what I've recommended you do. If people don't feel as though that they can share information, if people don't feel as though that they can have these conversations without fears, whether those fears are real or perceived, I think that any leader in an organization's first job would be to create that space, to create that environment. I think next too is that we have to have patience. I have launched a lot of things in my career where lots of teachers have looked at me on the first day and said, you want me to what? And I've never, I hope I have never been so dictatorial that I demanded you do this today, or I'm going to write you up, or I'm going to make your life miserable. But what I have learned over the years, and I've learned a lot, trust me, if I could go back 30 years and do some things differently, I probably would have. But I've learned that if you have patience and you continue to focus on what is important, the culture begins to take over. It begins to shape people's thinking. And what I have found in some extreme situations is that when you have some folks who are just like sandpaper against the culture, they start to feel, at one point they may have felt empowered in an organization. They are now not feeling that way anymore. They're feeling as though that the culture is changing around them, and their way of helping maintain a culture isn't working anymore. But starting from scratch, those 4 questions that I put up on the screen, I would do that. I would simply have a conversation with folks and say, you know what, we're going to start with 4 questions. You don't have to sign your name. We just want you to be honest. And you begin to build a structure where people know that their opinion matters, their ideas are valued, that what they think is important, and that they have a piece of the leadership of guiding a building. You know, engagement research, if you stay away from family engagement, if you just look at engagement research tells us that somewhere between 55 and 70% of the people inside of your organization right now are disengaged. And so what do we do about that? How do we engage folks outside of our schools if we are disengaged ourselves with what we do? So that might sound like a lofty answer, but I really do believe it starts with some very simple questions and the courage to have what I call crucial conversations, and not being defensive, and understanding that we're doing this because we all agree that we want to be better. Or if we don't agree on that, then we have to have that conversation. Do we believe that every child has the capacity to be successful in our school? There's a question. And who knows what answers that you'll get. But when you get an answer, now I want you to hold it up to artifact. What's there that supports it? And then I want you to hold it up against values. What in our actions show that we value this in our organization? And then I want you to hold it up to beliefs. What are we saying and doing and writing and thinking that's supporting that idea? I think it's a great place to start.
Awesome. I think so too. And there was a quote by Peter Drucker that kind of along those lines, you know, the culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? I think most people start with that strategy, but there's a step before that, right?
Let me tell you my other favorite Peter Drucker quote. I love Peter Drucker. I'm a Peter Drucker disciple. He once said, if you want to do something new, you got to stop doing something old. Most brilliant thing I've ever heard.
Love it, Steve. Another question, and again, I'm trying to group some of these, is really towards that. You know, let's say we've aligned our culture to engage with families, but how do we encourage families to participate without making them feel guilty? There's the subsequent is there a difference between engaging with families of lower socioeconomic means and those with higher? So I don't know if you want to parse those 2 questions out, but.
Well, you know, if I parse them out, we might have to extend this to a 3-hour workshop. This. Everybody wants to know that they have value. And we've talked in earlier webinars about the roots of disengagement. Where does it start? Why do parents feel guilty? And have we examined what that is? Have we really sat and listened about those issues? Have we examined our practices? Maybe signing the reading log at night is difficult for a family that works, 3 jobs, that doesn't want to admit that they're not there for their child to sign the reading log. So they lie. I understand it. But we have to dig deeper behind those issues. I think we have to examine our practices, because we do subtly do things in education. And I, you know me, every webinar I've ever said, and I throw myself right in the middle of this conversation. We do things because we believe that they're good for our school or good for our kids. You heard in the video, everybody's motivated by what they believe to be good. Well, what we believe to be good and what is good might be two different things. In terms of working with socioeconomically disadvantaged families, I don't want to cast any kinds of broad stroked definitions or paint any kind of families one way or another. I think all families struggle to be involved with their children. I think all families are busy. I think that there are added burdens on families who are struggling financially. I think that there are added burdens with families that might be struggling with other issues, other social or emotional issues that are manifesting themselves in schools. There's a long list of those things that happens. But that also happens in families that are not disadvantaged. There are, we, as a former superintendent, we spent meeting after meeting after meeting talking about mental health issues of students. And it wasn't one subgroup of student. It permeated every reporting group of student that we had in our school district, so and in our state. So I think that to understand that our message is, how do we let families know that we value them? What messages can we send every day? And we may have to send those every day for a year before somebody believes us. But what message can we send that says, I value you and I want you to be part of this? And what messages might we stop sending that might be blocking that family's participation?
Excellent. Steve, we've got time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to be at the top of the hour.
Do you have any easier questions, Gary?
I don't know if this next one's any easier, but I think it is relevant, just kind of given the school year that we've had. And I know you had a chance to speak to one of the districts that this applied to. So what role does safety play in creating necessary conditions for family engagement? And how is that part of the equation?
Yeah. Safety, we have to have safe school environments. We can't, it just is. We live in a society now that is different. And so has it been an impediment to the kind of engagement, the kind of welcoming, open environments that we want in our schools? Yeah. On the same hand, we have no option. We have to secure our children. We have to do everything in our power to keep our children safe. With that, though, I think that we can probably help families understand what we do and why we do it before we do it. When you heard in the video, when I explain it to a parent, they understand it. In my mind, I think, why didn't we just start there? Why didn't we share, did we put the buzzers and the cameras up without thinking about how we were going to share this message with every family? How did everybody find out that we have new doors or cameras? How did everybody find out that we now have an armed policeman? Those are the kinds of, it's not that we have to be safe, but it's how we share and engage people in the process of keeping our kids safe that help people feel better.
Awesome. There was a question around data. We'll cover that perhaps in another webinar, so stay tuned for that. There's probably an hour we could spend on that. But Steve, last question for you, and I think this is part of just one of your amazing abilities in terms of telling the story of family engagement and the power that story can have in changing people's culture. So the question really revolves around that. And a lot of times I use your stories as I'm going out and talking to communities as a way to change the culture. So last question for you. What is your favorite quote or anecdote to share at family training that you believe has the most impact?
Well, as you know, I became famous. My 15 minutes of fame peaked in 2001. It was a tremendous 15 minutes, by the way. when Time Magazine came to our school to learn about our successes and spent most of the article talking about our commitment to family engagement, what they were most fascinated with was what I had done early in my tenure as a principal. My experience as I was, it's a long story that we can't go into in this webinar, but my first experience in the school was to be standing behind a counter in a main office and pretty much being ignored by everybody behind the counter who were not aware that I was in fact the new principal. And I found that to be a very interesting experience. And I talk about it in most of the speeches I do, and I've written about it, and Time Magazine has written about it. So it's well documented. But most people think that the action I took was to be dramatic or to make a point. And perhaps that's true. You can debate that forever. But what I thought about that day was, if that's how I was treated, how are you treated if you don't look like me, if your skin color is different, if you don't speak English or don't speak English well, if you don't dress in a manner that we find to be appropriate? How are other people treated? And so I became famous for ripping the counter out of the main office, and by doing so, tremendously irritating at least 2 secretaries, and probably more. But that counter to me, in my mind, was a physical artifact of a barrier. It said, "Don't cross this line. You are not welcome beyond this point." And that is absolutely the antithesis of the message that I wanted to send to anybody who visited our school. So I ripped the counter out.